UN Commission on the Status of Women. On the occasion of the 66th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the Journalists and Writers Foundation is organizing a series of parallel events to gather renowned scholars, experts, and practitioners to discuss pressing issues and offer innovative policy recommendations to achieve climate goals through gender equality. Global Actions Towards SDG 5, Gender Equality, parallel event will discuss the successful actions and offer policy inputs for the challenges induced by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the rise of all forms of violence against women in social and economic life. The changing dimensions of development policies responding to such crises must also be gender responsive and ensure women's rights and girls' empowerment. As the member states continue their diplomatic efforts in intergovernmental platforms to foster sustainable development, civil society organizations remain as the critical stakeholders for the full implementation of SDG 5, gender equality.
Good afternoon to all of our audience today joining us at this Commission on the Status of Women parallel event on the global actions towards SDG 5, gender equality, organized by the Journalists and Writers Foundation. I am Cemre Ülker, the UN representative of the JWF. Today we are gathered at the CSW session with several distinguished experts to discuss the full and effective implementation of the SDG 5. And specifically cover some of the fundamental working areas, priorities addressed by this goal, achieving gender equality. Right now, we are live through the NGO CSW events platform and the JWF's YouTube channel as well. Throughout the discussion, I encourage everyone to share their opinions, feedbacks, and any questions to any specific experts here on the panel today in the chat, either in Zoom or over YouTube, for us to cover them in the Q&A session. Foremost, before we start our discussion today, I would like to acknowledge that we stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian women and girls. We will continue to support them in all possible means, all women indeed, who have been bravely defending their nation's freedom since the beginning of this crisis. It is a tragic truth that at a time such as Commission on the Status of Women, where member states are gathering with women's rights advocates in partnership with UN agencies, we still have to talk about the ways to combat crimes of aggression, women's rights under armed conflicts. And I must also underline the universality of human rights. Crimes against humanity, different forms of political, social persecutions are taking place all around the world. Ukraine is only the latest. Despite the promises and the deadlines, as of today, Afghan girls are still banned from schools. As we join our efforts to combat all forms of human rights violations and mass atrocities, we must take the same conscious awareness towards every country, where individuals' dignity, their right to live in peaceful societies are violated. There is still no country or no part of the social, economic, political life where women and girls are fully equal, have an access to equal resources, skill sets, and they are provided equal opportunities to meaningfully participate in all spheres of life. However, of course, disparities are getting even wider in some regions compared to other parts of the world where the pillars of socioeconomic development are more prosperous and women's rights are relatively better promoted. The socioeconomic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have adversely affected recent progress on gender equality. Violence against women and girls has intensified. Increasing effects of climate crisis continue to impact women and girls disproportionately, and they still remain underrepresented in critical decision-making positions to create gender mainstreaming policy actions. To counter-react this increasing gaps of many different forms and considering the changing dynamics of development trends, We must create opportunities to reshape, rebuild systems, laws, policies, and institutions in order to advance gender-sensitive actions and address the specific needs of women and girls. Before we continue with the specific themes that we will cover today, in light of our experts' remarks, I would like to share some of the most striking facts of gender inequality on a global scale to present a broader framework for today's discussion. The latest snapshot of gender inequality reporting of the UN Foundation presents important highlights. To make a reference to some of them, according to the World Bank statistics, 32 countries still have no laws in their constitution defining and addressing domestic violence. In 20 countries, the laws exempt perpetrators from rape charges if they marry the survivor. More than 2.5 billion girls and women around the world are affected by discriminatory laws and the lack of legal protection, lack of access to seek justice. 30% of the countries still restrict women's freedom of movement. There are 98 countries that are not legally required to provide equal pay work of equal value. In 38 countries, employers can legally dismiss pregnant workers. As of 2021, on a global scale, women only hold 25.6% of the parliament seats around the world. There are many areas with striking statistics that we have to strengthen collaborations, public-private partnerships on local, global, regional levels to address these challenges and gaps. Coming back to our focus area today, we will elaborate on some of the relevant themes to combat such gender inequalities and fully implement SDG 5. As we will hear more from our panelists shortly, and within the limited time that we have today, we will address some of the most critical areas: all forms of violence, the role of women to have effective roles in various decision-making mechanisms, embracing feminist leadership norms, and of course, male leadership to create strong partnerships for them to be important stakeholders of the gender mainstreaming of all the global goals. Let's start with the gender-based violence and the shadow pandemic. It is very striking that UN Women reports that globally over 200 million women and girls were abused by an intimate partner only in the past year. And as I mentioned earlier, tens of countries are missing jurisdictions addressing violence against women within the globally set embrace standards. I myself specialize in monitoring women's rights violations in Turkey and all forms of violence. I can say that even though there may be enough frameworks on any specific country-specific situation to protect women from domestic violence, when the political will is missing to implement such human rights mechanisms, we cannot achieve progress. And at this point, I would like to introduce Myrna Dawson. She's a professor of sociology and research leadership chair of the College of Social and Applied Human Sciences at the University of Guelph. She is the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Social and Legal Responses to Violence and the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability. For 10 years, Dawson was a Canada Research Chair in Public Policy in Criminal Justice. She has spent more than 2 decades researching social and legal responses to violence with emphasis on violence against women, children, and femicide. Myrna, I would really appreciate if you could share your expertise with us, covering the unprecedented increase in domestic violence and femicide, which really reached a peak during the COVID-19 crisis. How can women escape this death trap of ending all forms of violence? Or I would highly appreciate you are a part of several important organizations as well addressing this crisis. So we would be very glad to hear from your organizational, institutional work best practices as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and Dish with One Spoon Wampum, As we work towards ending gender-based violence, I recognize the disproportionate impact of violence against Indigenous peoples in Canada and beyond, especially Indigenous women and girls, and the ongoing systemic violence directed at Indigenous and other racialized or minoritized groups. I'm committed to doing my part to decolonize and advocate for real systemic change. So thank you to the Journalists and Writers Foundation for the invitation to discuss SDG 5 progress, and specifically the impacts of gender-based violence during COVID and post-COVID. For many, including myself, I think there is no greater concern than the impact of COVID-19 toward gender equality and the empowerment of girls and women. What we have witnessed in the past 2+ years is what I would call the reversal of progress in gender equality, with the pendulum swinging rapidly backwards for women and girls globally, with one indicator being increases in gender-based violence. I just want to give some examples of what some of these documented increases are, and then talk about one way to think about how we can frame this in terms of our response that will have to come quickly. Where data are available, many countries have reported increased calls to domestic violence helplines, shelters, and outreach agencies. There have been increased reports to police about domestic violence and hate crimes. There's more reports of sexual harassment and other forms of violence against women in public spaces. There's more online sexual exploitation, harassment, and abuse, which is not surprising, I think, to many of us, because there's an increasing reliance on technology during the pandemic. Some countries are reporting surges in violence against women and girls upwards of 25%, where others report that their cases have doubled. Increases in the frequency and severity of violence against women and girls have also been documented. For example, increases in sex or gender-related killings of women and girls, which is sometimes referred to as femicide or feminicide, have been documented in many countries, such as Spain, Mexico, Turkey, Honduras, South Africa, El Salvador, and the United States. Many other countries as well. In Canada, for example, we have recently documented a 26% increase in the killings of women and girls, mostly by men, in 2021 compared to the pre-pandemic year of 2019. While we still need more comprehensive overtime data, these emerging trends are deeply concerning, not only because it was predicted by many, but because these numbers must be considered minimum estimates only. I thought a lot about the impact of COVID-19 on gender-based violence, and I have found one concept to be particularly useful to understanding this, and that is the concept of disaster patriarchy. Disaster patriarchy is used to describe the parallel process whereby male-dominated society exploits a crisis, in this case COVID-19, to reassert control and dominance over women and girls, and to erase any hard-earned rights women have gained toward gender equality. And the term racialized disaster patriarchy, coined by Rachel Luft, recognizes that it is often those whom society has already made most vulnerable and marginalized who are further exploited during such disasters. As we know, gender inequality is a root cause of male violence against women and girls in both public and private spheres. In addition, misogyny, both individual and systemic, is also a root cause of male violence against women and girls. And here I adopt the most common definition of misogyny as the dislike or hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against women. Resting on these foundations, ongoing gender inequality and misogyny, disaster patriarchy underscores why and how COVID-19 has exacerbated the already pandemic levels of violence against women. Albeit some of this violence is the larger burden is borne by some countries in particular. Simply put, gender-based violence flourishes under conditions of inequity, oppression, and unequal power relations, impacting some women and girls more profoundly due to their experiences of overlapping oppression such as race, religion, age, ability, and sexuality. So how has disaster patriarchy directly and indirectly contributed to the rise in gender-based violence? And I think understanding these direct and indirect contributors is important to understanding how we respond. There are at least 4 direct contributors. First, lockdowns and other restrictions have increased the vulnerability of women and girls. We do know that informal restrictions on the movements of women and girls has always been a reality for women and girls living with violence. However, at the height of COVID-19, and still today, male partners and family members have exploited formal and official restrictive measures to reinforce their own control and dominance over women and children, often using exposure to COVID-19 as an additional threat. Second, for many women and children, COVID-19 has meant fewer places to find safety and peace, even if only for a short period of time, given that many public locations such as schools, workplaces, community centers, and shelters are closed or still remain on restricted hours. Therefore, strategies that women had developed over time to protect themselves and their children were no longer available and are still restricted today. Third, increased stress, fear, and anxiety about health issues, as well as financial pressures, particularly for crowded and or economically precarious households, saw women and children bearing the brunt of frustrations when trapped with abusive partners or family members. Increased substance use and reduced peer and social supports have also impacted stressors in the home and across individuals. Finally, at the same time, all this was happening, limited but valuable resources were being diverted from violence against women responses to address the more immediate needs of COVID-19. For many countries, this meant that anti-violence against women organizations, already underfunded, were looking for innovative ways to continue to deliver their crucial prevention work under lockdowns and often with fewer funds. Some countries, including Canada, provided COVID-19 response packages to support these services in their efforts during COVID. This is a welcome response, but for services who are chronically underfunded with little sustained funding, it is a stopgap measure at best. There are also at least three indirect contributors from disaster patriarchy, and these pose longer-term impacts. First, women and girls who generally earn less, hold more precarious jobs, and more often live in poverty have felt the economic impacts of COVID-19 more acutely. This has implications for their economic power, autonomy, education, and consequently their ability to remain safe from male violence, both in private and in public. Second is the increase in unpaid work, including care work, which has been downloaded onto women and girls who already carried more of those responsibilities prior to the pandemic. For example, women more often than men have taken up care work stemming from children being out of school and having to learn at home, as well as heightened care needs for older persons and ill family members. As women take on these greater demands, they are disproportionately impacted by job losses and layoffs, which again reverses gains made in female income levels and labor force participation. This means in turn, they are more reliant on male partners and family members are pushed into poverty, increasing their exposure to violence. Finally, when documenting the incidence and prevalence of violence against women and girls, data quality, which has always been an issue, has become more of an issue with COVID-19. Agencies often responsible for collecting data have been focused more immediately on responding to COVID-19. As a result, data collected during this period must be treated with extra caution and treated as minimum estimates. For example, focusing on femicide in particular, some killings of women and girls may have been misclassified, particularly during the height of COVID-19 when coroners and morgues were responding to high caseloads and demands for autopsies. In addition, there are reports of increases in women and girls who have gone missing, whose possible deaths may go undiscovered and thus unrecorded, an issue prior to COVID-19, particularly in Canada with respect to Indigenous women and girls, but even more so now. So how can we respond to disaster patriarchy during and post COVID-19? It might seem trite to say, but ongoing advocacy and activism with a particular emphasis on increasing public education and awareness needs to be prioritized going forward. Focusing on femicide as the tip of the iceberg, that is the goal of the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, which was launched in 2017. Our overall objective is to bring visible, national, and global attention to femicide and violence against women and girls as a result more generally. With an emphasis on research, education, advocacy, and partnership building, we believe civil society organizations and bottoms-up grassroots initiatives must push political and social leaders to respond adequately to gender-based violence. If pressure does not continue, no change will happen. In doing so, the Observatory uses social media as a key mechanism for education and awareness, as well as global partnership building, connecting with similar groups and organizations worldwide. As part of our activities, we focus on the court's response to femicide because the law symbolically represents to society how serious or not these crimes are seen to be. And we also focus on the media because it shapes how the public perceives this violence, and at the same time, the media are a key but underused tool for violence prevention. In short, understanding how these largely male-dominated institutions perceive and respond to gender-based violence simultaneously documents how society views these types of crimes, including problematic attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes about violence against women and girls that continue to be the main obstacle to effective prevention efforts. Where to from here? There's not enough time to, I think, emphasize everything that I'd like to emphasize. I'm just going to focus on four key things. The first is violence prevention needs to be included as a key component of any country's COVID-19 recovery response. And this response must include women, not just with the add and stir approach adopted by many governments, but as leaders or co-leaders, which will allow women and girls to be the real substantive change makers that we are. Second, we need more support, including funding for grassroots initiatives who advocate for better responses to gender-based violence. According to the Global Fund for Women, funding for grassroots organizations is about 1% of all funding and less for women-led organizations. This is despite the fact that most of the heavy lifting when it comes to advocating for better responses to gender-based violence is done by these organizations. For example, when it comes to increasing attention to femicide in the past decade, grassroots feminist initiatives, particularly in Latin America, can be credited for their efforts, as well as multiple volunteer women-led groups in other parts of the world. In fact, the Canadian Femicide Observatory grew out of such a movement, a small feminist grassroots group who came together in the late 1980s out of a concern for violence against women in their communities. Third, sustained funding is needed for those providing frontline services, community outreach, sexual assault centers, shelters, and other violence prevention organizations. Currently, these services largely limp along without the ability to plan for the future. They spend crucial time that could be dedicated to the women and children they serve, jumping through government hoops to keep the money they need to do the work we need them to do. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, and perhaps the biggest challenge, we need to focus more on community and societal level solutions, rather than locating the full responsibility for change in victims and perpetrators. Victims and perpetrators are individuals, but they live in larger communities and are influenced by broader society. This means tackling not just systemic contributors to gender inequality and misogyny, but also systemic racism, colonialism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and other harmful gender norms that prevent effective violence against women and girls. This requires that our governments recognize that we have a problem in the first place, that is and will continue to be resistant to anything but long-term, whole-of-system, sustained solutions. This requires real and substantive political will and commitment. No country has yet to witness this political will or commitment. If not now, when? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mirna. You made very important highlights, and I really appreciate that you started your remarks sharing the truthful situation. Really, we're experiencing reversal, backward trends indeed in the empowerment of women and girls throughout the world. And that was very important that you shared the roots of violence against women. And what really resonated with me the most is the importance of data collection, and I will definitely come back to you in the Q&A session. Let's talk more about this, because it's indeed very important. When we do not have concrete scientific data, the monitoring mechanisms are not really effective. And I also fully agree with you on the importance of the bottom-up approach. It is my personal approach as well in whichever development strategy that we are elaborating. The empowerment of civil society organizations, as you mentioned, in the recovery responses, and making sure that governments lead inclusive policy mechanisms, empowering grassroots civil society organizations as stakeholders. Those are very important highlights. Thank you so much. And now let's turn to Hafsa Girdap as our next speaker. She is the Executive Director of the Advocates of Silence Turkey and the founding member of Set Them Free, working to raise awareness on women's rights violations in Turkey. Girdap is also a PhD candidate in Women's and Gender Studies at Stony Brook University, New York. Her research areas are human rights and women's status in Muslim context, specifically the integration and adaptation of Muslim immigrant women while redefining their cultural identities. In addition to her professional human rights work and academic studies, Girdap conducts research at the European Center for Populism Studies Gender Program as a non-resident research associate. Hafsa, in the beginning, we underlined several stats on the missing leadership of women to construct gender mainstreaming policies at all levels, and women's meaningful presence is a must to bring specific needs, gender-related violations, violence, and all sorts of policy dynamics. Can you please share your insights on the role of feminist norms, values in achieving SDG 5? And I would really appreciate if you can give us a framework on the way that feminist leadership and its norms, values are endorsing different forms of social, economic, political empowerment initiatives, programs, policy makings that we have been talking about. Thank you so much.
I actually want to thank that. It's a very important discussion, considering the ongoing situation all around the world. And I'm happy, that I am taking the topic from Mirna, because I'm gonna, draw a very parallel line, in terms of theory combining with practice, as an academic and as an activist. So I will problematize gender equality issue by touching on feminist discourses, feminist movements, and specifically transnational feminism, drawing on political unity, universal solidarity, and of course, feminist leadership as a scholar in the academic realm, as well as an activist in the grassroots. While doing such a discussion, we as scholars and activists should and would keep in mind that interlocking actors that Mirna just mentioned, there are lots of interlocking actors and factors that they should be recognized while taking feminist steps in researches and in activism work, in order to urge decision makers to take action in terms of gender equality or eliminating gender-based injustices, inequalities. And at this point, Bell Hooks is both a feminist scholar and a feminist activist, describes this kind of movements and feminist work, as a transformational politic. So what we are here dealing with as an issue is a political problem. And it should be addressed again through politics, politicians, decision makers, decisions, policies, by an effort to transform. We live in a world of crisis, unfortunately, and we are governed by politics of domination. And in other words, fight against gender-based injustices can and should be carried out by recognizing gender and sex-based oppression as the first step, so that patriarchal powers that dominate individuals, communities, institutions, laws can be addressed efficiently to combat oppression or inequalities and injustices. Challenges created by patriarchal hegemony are intersectional, interlocking. So we cannot homogenize gender-based oppression into limited features. To be more precise, hegemonic domination subjugates and oppresses others through intersectional systems such as race, class, religion, ethnicity, culture, along with sex and gender. Yet this does not necessarily mean we as feminist scholars and activists cannot generate universal solidarity through which different kinds of gender-based oppression could be combated. Universality of gender oppression is problematic. Yes, we can talk about universal gender-based rights, but we also should acknowledge contextuality of gender-based oppression or gender inequality. And accordingly, we should generate solutions, take actions by addressing specific conditions in specific locations. And in accordance with the global aspect of intersectionality of patriarchal domination, I can give Turkey case as an example coming from Turkey to illustrate what I said theoretically. Patriarchal domination feeds itself and consolidates more power in the hands of men because of the lack of unity between women with, from different views, ideologies, and faith backgrounds. And in the Turkey case, dominating power has changed hands and discourses in the historical context through regime changes. in one era, nationalism became the oppressor. Then it was ultra-secularism, and currently the dominating power is the Islamist discourse, which manipulates political Islamist discourse, which manipulates the actors and the extent of oppression. In short, like many other issues, gender-based matters are interpreted and manipulated by leaders, regimes, societies through different venues such as religion, politics, culture. In addition to the argument that I made now, in the absence of political unity, oppressors could have the chance to utilize women as proxies in order to generate discrimination and dominance against other women. In this regard, correspondingly, I'd like to draw attention to the significance of a common political goal that acknowledging the interconnectedness of sex, race, class, and also the common oppression would and should lead women, feminists to establish unity. And this kind of awareness would not only let women with different experiences and identities learn about each other, but also men feel the need for transformation by means of collective engagement and participation within the feminist struggle to build solidarity for the fight against hegemonic oppression. I mean, collaboration, solidarity, and unity against the oppressor, whether tradition or populist discourses or political use of religion, will empower the oppressed and open doors for a positive transformation in terms of exploitation of inequality and injustices. Bonding and eventually having the opportunity of a broader discussion might enable the sharing of perspectives and strategies for change that would enrich rather than diminish our understanding of gender. Coming back to universal solidarity for gender equality through transnational feminism, sticking to universal norms would easily establish political unity globally and transnationally. And by means of a collective action, embracing the differences of sex, race, and class as intersectional structures of domination, a true solidarity could be established, and it could challenge the oppressive patriarchal domination mechanisms with a snowballing impact. Having both theoretical and practical aspects, feminism plays a significant role in resisting interlocking systems of gender-based discrimination, violence, and oppression that's put forward by patriarchal powers, as well as in well-established knowledge production and transformations in regard to equality and social justice. And in feminist discourses and movements, activism, the essential element is gender and equal status of genders, not traditions, not religions or other cultural and contextual norms, even though strategies vary to generate empowerment and transformation. In light of these ideas and arguments, I would like to continue with possible practical actions that could be taken to define inequality, discrimination, oppression that is carried out by patriarchal domination. Reminding again Bell Hooks' paradigm of critical consciousness, we can propose that feminist education poses as a vital component to initiate conscious raising. In order to achieve such an awareness, smaller groups should mobilize more along with larger masses. In other words, it's not reasonable to separate the academia from the social movements in terms of feminist action. The marriage of theory and practice would strengthen the resistance against hegemonic oppression. Specific trainings in smaller groups, contexts would bring the opportunity to integrate critical analysis with discussion of personal experience. And in such an environment where people come together in small numbers, it becomes easier to bring men and women within the same communities together and let them discuss feminist concerns, gender-based discrimination and inequalities concerns. And that is to say, individuals and groups could have the chance to communicate in their own settings where they feel comfortable enough and safe to discuss controversial issues, regardless of their literacy level, which remains as a critical component to be able to debate these matters in academic environments. This also prevents feminist concerns to be in the hands of only privileged persons in regard to whiteness, upper class, and male dominance. And in relation to critical consciousness, I'd like to mention the United Nations program to eliminate discrimination and violence against women, which includes a part that generates education of boys and men by stressing out that violence against women and girls is rooted in widely accepted gender norms about men's authority and use of violence to exert control over women. As half of the world's population, effective interventions must engage men in order to address the underlying discriminatory social norms that legitimizes male power, control, and use of violence. And in the same program, there is also this fact, this part, and I love it, bringing the topic to feminist leadership. It says that popular culture figures who ascribe to human rights and gender equality and model, good behavior can also champion the effort with their social influence and ability to reach larger audiences quickly through messages, media messages. And this is sort of an example of feminist leadership in community base. And indeed, I'd like to extend the problematization of the idea of identifying men as the enemy. Instead, I recommend taking patriarchal domination and hegemonic oppression into consideration as a mindset, a discourse, so that it would be more straightforward to generate theories, actions, practices for the fight against them. And in other words, a transformative vision of a feminist leadership for a more just world, free from poverty, free from oppression, patriarchy, requires transformative feminist leaders. Leaders, regardless of their gender identities, enable others to lead, building power with them instead of over them. And in that regard, feminist leadership requires inclusion, sharing power, a real concrete collaboration, dismantling biases. In such a manner, one of the most impactful solutions would be establishing and sticking to universal norms that are adopted by feminist leadership, being transformative challenges the existing structures of power. It is inclusive in the sense that it takes into account the needs, interests, and points of view of everyone. So let me put it this way: feminist transformative leadership can be carried out by women and men, all genders, young or old, all ages, white, black, brown, all colors, all races, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, all religions, focusing on the equality of all genders, all colors, all races. And feminist leadership can achieve their goals through a legislative power. This is very important to eliminate gender discrimination and to provide equal protection under the law. And another thing feminist leadership takes on and achieves is acknowledging individuals' abilities and actively directing individuals to a path to power, not only in positions related to gender issues, but in any field that they are empowered. To wrap it up, I'd like to mention 3 feminist leaders, in the contemporary world. According to a piece in Time magazine, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, the president of Finland, Niinistö, has aimed to decrease violence against women by 5% over the next 5 years by requiring all soldiers in the Finnish defense forces to learn about aggression, control, and violence prevention. And in Finland, almost all young men will be required to complete an education program on violence against women. Another leader is Prime Minister of Japan. He's proposing a bill that would require all public sector institutions and companies with more than 301 employees to demonstrate concrete action plans to increase the representative of women. And lastly, my favorite, I know that she is the favorite of many people in terms of gender equality, Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand leader. She's very well known for her comprehensive actions that prevented the spread of COVID in her country. Thank you so much for listening, for the opportunity to share my experience and ideas.
Hafsa, thanks a lot. That was a great talk, and it was very important that you started with this transformative role of political will in combating gender-based violence. It's a very dear perspective to me too. As we discussed, there are enough national human rights mechanisms, conventions, many tools, international tools to protect women's rights. But when there's this missing political will, it doesn't really mean much. And that was also important that you put a stress on the unity against oppression and abusive gender-based policy making, because we discussed this in some other platforms too. Unfortunately, one-man regimes are more united among themselves than us as civil society leaders. So we should endorse better collaborations within our peaceful civil initiatives. That was also very...
Cemre, I'm sorry, you said that, one-man regimes come together, they have dictators clubs. So why, this is, I think, Mesih Alinejad that put forward, there is the dictators club. Why not, these feminist, fighters are coming together for a club, meeting. Yeah.
Definitely, we have a lot to do in that area. And that was also important that you discussed how important academic theories of different thoughts, schools of thought should be put into action by embedding the feminist norms and values. And lastly, I really like that you put an emphasis on the provision of gender trainings to either different levels of government officials or armed forces, police forces, because this is a very important mission of the women, peace and security agenda as well, provision of gender trainings, women's rights education, and how to combat violence against women from oppressive regimes as well. So thank you so much for all these important remarks. We will surely come back again to these during the Q&A session. And lastly, we will hear from Sylvain Obedi, who is a disability rights activist, national gender advocate, and executive director of Enable the Disabled Action. Sylvain is a former member of the Generation Equality Youth Task Force. Currently, he is the deputy coordinator of the Young African Leaders Initiative in North Kivu Province, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and a member of the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network, a global network of children and youth with disabilities. He's an independent consultant on issues of human rights, social and gender inclusion, and youth involvement in decision-making groups. Sylvain, thank you so much for being the he for she at today's gathering. Your insights for today's discussion are very, very important, as all the gender equality goals must be supported by male leadership, as they have unproportionately higher access to decision-making mechanisms. We do need more male gender experts leadership to really put an emphasis on the fact that women's rights are a matter of equality for all, and we must it must matter for everyone equally. It must never be an agenda, a development issue, a priority for women activists only. Can you please share your expertise and insights in this particular area? And if possible, I would appreciate if you can talk about the Generation Equality Forum as well, which is a very important arena for the leadership positions in making women's rights a global issue for everyone. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate. I may begin for thank you for this opportunity to give me the floor. And as I can begin speaking about Generational Equality Forum, and then I will finish about my engagement as a he for she. And for the beginning, the generational equality as we're speaking about gender issues, and it is about gender issues, and the generational equality is a formal like a solution which was seen by UN Human, and they tried to think from organization to mobilize organization and feminists, also young and private sector and countries or public sector. all of them, they tried to see how they can make coalition, that coalition, which is the Action Coalition, and the coalition is very important because the generation is not only an object, is very important for the well-being of the world, and it's also very important for the respect of human rights of women and all girls. Also, it's very important because it helps us to do the elaboration of the new economic system and social inclusive function for everyone in in the world. And with this COVID-19 pandemic, this whole effort about gender equality was now missed, because every rights are making everything or work which was done. No country is able to attain its objective about gender equality. And for why the Action Coalition are important. Action Coalition are important because it is speaking about intersectionality, about feminist leadership, about the transformation. All these are some of objective of Action Coalition, and every champion from Action Coalition, they are there to take engagement and to see how they can work collectively with organization, governments, and institution, with enterprise, to see how collectively they can work to work about gender equality. And they try to see how they can have some objectives, and then they see how countries can international organization, institutional, how they can make in place some founders to found about action, and also to make in practice policies, and to make a plan which can work how they can make the end of the violence. After that, they can also work on how they can take strategy to have funds for feminist activists or organization to find on gender issues. And at the end, I can speak about my experience as a man. So as a man in the movement of he for she, I do appreciate the engagement in this time, because it's everyone who is speaking about gender, but the very important thing is not to speak, is what we are doing in our life. How, as I can tell me I'm an activist of human rights, or an activist of the rights of human. How is my life which I'm living every day? Am I working in the image of that I can say that thing which I'm saying I'm doing? Because in the living situation, then we may see the very good engagement. because I may be here and do speak about this, but I'm not living what am I speaking. It means that is the engagement of men to work together with women. It begin firstly to take women as a partner. It means that we are equal and we can work together to achieve what we want to have as changement in our communities, to give to give the place which myself I can have in the community, to give that place to share to share that place with that woman. I mean, that is the very good engagement which men can take. It is instead of taking discourse, speaking about what we think we can do, but we are not living what we are thinking. And it's important to change our behavior, to let what we can be speaking, but we may be living what we think we can speak, and it's about that we can be able to give a good world that we can give to the next generation. Because I usually say, if 25 before today, if these discussions were started, humans began to have space on the table, maybe some of problem which we are trying to look for solution today could not be present, because it will have solution in the past. And it's for that we have to work hard today to show that this is problem is our all problem of us, is not only problem of women, and that is the way in which we can have solution. Thank you.
Well, Sylvain, thank you so much. You really put a great emphasis on many of the important points, but I think the point that resonated with me the most was this emphasis on the mobilization of he for she's for action, establishing qualitative measures, programs to empower women. And really, you took the issue right on spot from Hafsa, elaborating on the leadership, and your emphasis on community empowerment was very important, going back to Mirna's actually topics. So we perfectly aligned our discussion, because she also mentioned about the importance of bottom-up approach, empowering. It can be some religious leaders, community leaders, youth empowerment, male leadership, like you perfectly embraced yourself as well. Those are very critical points. Thank you so much for all your contributions today. And we are having some comments over YouTube as well. Everyone is really motivated by all the issues that we are discussing, making great emphases. And I have a couple questions, maybe, and please, everyone is more than welcome to join in the Q&A session to share their reflections. I would like to go back to Mirna, because I think data gathering is a very critical problem that we encounter, not for women's rights only, for all the effective implementation of SDGs. We do really need concrete data. But as we will talk about more in depth for the violence against women in the Q&A session as well, I really think that monitoring the system myself as well, member states lack incentives to share data on femicide, killings of women, gender-based killings. And sometimes it is due to the fact that not enough effective measures are implementing. Sometimes it is really the missing mechanisms to collect data. And I am a big fan of Canadian Homicide Observatory as well. You are doing a terrific job in raising awareness every single day, mobilizing your resources. But what are your specific thoughts in this missing data? What can we do to strengthen as civil society stakeholders? How can we close this data gathering gap?
Thank you. And thank you to the other panelists for your comments and stuff. It's got my mind working in so many different directions after hearing both of you speak. I think, data is often a boring topic, but in this sense, I don't think it needs to be a boring topic. I think it has to be a priority topic. And one of the reasons I say that is because one of the messages that I've been trying to get out lately is that data collection has to be for prevention. It can't be for an administrative exercise that the government adopts just because we've been collecting data in a particular way for 30 or 40 years. And I think there's two things happening. There's accessibility, which I agree with you that there's a lot of official data that's not accessible to researchers who actually could use that data in ways to inform prevention. But actually, even after accessibility, the quality data in terms of understanding violence against women and gender-based violence and femicide is actually not there because we have been collecting administrative data in the same way for many years. And that administrative data doesn't actually target prevention in particular. And so I'll use my own country as an example. Statistics Canada is recognized globally as quite a reputable, legitimate agency for collecting statistics. And I don't for a second dispute that. But if we take that as an example of some of the variables that we can't capture adequately in our homicide data, for example, focusing on women killed, we can't get an accurate information on separation process. We can't get accurate information on prior violence and those sorts of things. And so I think it really starts to beg the question of how can we improve the data? And I think one of the reasons I like to emphasize the grassroots initiatives is because a lot of the femicide watches and observatories that have existed for many years prior to the call from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on violence against women have been grassroots initiatives. Often they've been volunteer initiatives, and they've really brought a focus to this issue. And I guess, just to close, I think the issue for data has been, an invisibility of certain victims of gender-based violence in that data, based on race, ability, age, etc., has become even more concerning to me because of the overburdened systems that are supposed to be collecting these data. And so one of the examples that I want to use, and I'm just going to look at my other screen here for a second, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime released 2020 data in which they found that 81,000 women and girls have been killed in the context of an intimate partner or family violence in 2020. And that compares to 87,000 that were killed in 2017, a report that they released at that point. So that's a reduction of about 6,000. Now, the proportion of women and girls killed by family and intimate partners stayed about the same, around 58% of those two totals. So what starts to build in my mind is all those deaths, often that maybe occur outside the context of intimacy and family, in which countries who are grappling with COVID deaths in their morgues and coroner's offices, which were perhaps, handled quickly. And I've talked to different people in different parts of the world who had said that some of the morgues had so many bodies. It's traumatic to talk about it like this way, that femicide victims probably got reclassified or classified in particular ways. So the reduction says to me, what is the data quality that was collected in 2017 compared to the data quality collected in 2020? And what do we need to recognize about that changes in quality to sort of be cautious about the data? I hope that addresses your question.
Perfectly. Really, you mentioned that sometimes data collection is perceived only for academic purposes, but not really. We do need concrete data for making successful policies as well. And Hafsa, you're both a practitioner and academic as well. How do you analyze this gap in data in your own research areas? I mean, you mainly focus on identity issues, but cross-data usage is very relevant in analyzing so many issues for women's empowerment. Do you counter such problem in terms of accessing data or legitimate data sets?
In particular context, yes, especially in dictatorships, reaching out to reliable data, access to the environments and institutions to collect data, it's almost impossible. But I'm not a statistics person, coming from humanities area. But, I believe in the qualitative, methodology in researches too. In my researches, I am using qualitative interviewing methodology to actually reaching the correct information that is told by the subjects themselves. So yeah, maybe not through the organizations or corporations who collect data, professionally, quantitatively. I also, believe that qualitative methods are also can work in that area.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your reflections. We have another question in the Q&A tab here by Mehmet Kılıç. He's asking, how can we overcome negative effects of patriarchal powers in society, including cultural and religious factors, to promote gender equality and gender-based violence against women and girls? Hafsa, you majorly covered this issue. Would you like to add anything besides your former remarks on patriarchal powers?
Yeah,
how to overcome the negative effects?
I would be happy to, share my initial maybe suggestions coming from the area, the field. I would propose unique programs, both in the feminist movements and academia. Meetings and debates could be organized. It's not only, the grassroots organizations, it can be any, centers of communities, any institutions. It can extend to any individuals. So meetings and debates could be organized to bring, different people from different parts of the world who have, feminist concerns to discuss each other's experiences of oppression and in detail, so that they would have the chance to learn about each other, to feel what others feel, because emotions and empathy also play a huge role here, and to understand each other, and most importantly, to emphasize with each other for creating solidarity. Again, I'm obsessed with solidarity, but it's very important too, and transformational unity, of course. The academia in particular could and should initiate exchange teaching programs in which feminist scholars visit universities across the world and learn and teach different feminist theories, practices at the same time. Given the current pandemic circumstances, the prevalence of virtual education, this would be much more easier with, online virtual alternatives. And also grassroots organizations, on the other hand, can create international virtual training programs and workshops. I know that He4She organization has this kind of workshops, mostly targeting young males or, adult males. And these workshops can, be helpful in that regard. And in this case, women or individuals from Mozambique could communicate with women or individuals from Canada or Turkey, and they could exchange ideas with Australian individuals in terms of feminist concerns. And moreover, feminist individuals and organizations with more opportunities could help women or, discriminated genders in undeveloped and poor communities reach out to international commissions, entities such as special rapporteurs on violence against women under the United Nations, or for submitting their individual cases as reports to get help. I mean, that's my initial suggestion.
Yeah, thank you. And as you took the floor, Hafsa, maybe one more question to you, because I know you carry out so many community engagements for youth empowerment as well. And we spoke on the importance of He4She's to strengthen so many policies in terms of combating violence against women. Would you like to share any best practices from the communities that you have been engaging in terms of maybe educating young leaders in this specific area, or maybe some male leadership best practices from the community, grassroots youth empowerment that you would like to share?
This is the topic that I feel, excited a lot about. So I am mentoring youth members in my community, not just in New York, globally, through our organization, grassroots organization. And as an instructor, as a teacher who believes people can learn while teaching, by teaching. We are getting ready for United Nations CSW panels, conferences, or we are attending other, events, exchange ideas. So while preparing, academic work or speeches or, panel presentations, these youth members in our communities learn what people go through and what to generate to overcome such, problems. So, workshops or projects that we can mentor the youth members in our communities, I think work really well in that matter.
Yeah, thank you. I think youth leadership has a lot to carry on, and their meaningful participation is very important, not only physical presence. And I can say since the last maybe 5 or 6 years, especially with the leadership of the Special Envoy on Youth, she does carry out an exemplary leadership to mobilize young activists, creating more space for them to really meaningfully utilize all of their potentials to be a part of the change at any UN premises. So I really think that youth leadership is an important part of combating violence against women and also all sorts of women's rights and girls' empowerment issues. Our next question is really addressing COVID-19 pandemic, and I would like to turn to Sylvain. How did the COVID-19 pandemic impact women and girls in terms of violence in Congo and in Africa? Would you like to share some insights in terms of COVID-19 pandemic and the violence intersection?
Thank you for this question. Really, as everyone know, pandemic of this COVID-19 affected much women and girls in Africa, and especially I can speak as is in Congo. You know, before COVID, there is some girls or women in local who were doing some economic activity, and that was helping them to take care of their families. But when COVID-19 comes, they were not able to continue with their activities because they was be able to stay at home with the whole pandemic measure, which was taken by public authorities to not be going to the market, speaking, and that's they will be staying there for eating now what they were selling. To me, that the economy was affected much, and apart from that, as domestic violence was also a part, because when men was staying at home, they was not going to work. It means that every time the men they have now to come in to their wife or girls to do all which they want to do, because when they was going to work, it gave some time to women when also he can come with something from his work. It's try to give to her a respect, but with pandemic, economic of women and girls was not really good, and even that COVID-19 affected also the rights of education. Do you know, some of girls in local community don't not have access to education, and when they were going to education, that was helping for them to not their rights for not being violent. Even some of girls, when they were staying at home with confinement to stay at home, some of them was raped and has many pregnancy in that period. It means that really COVID-19 had affected the rights of women and girls in Africa and in DRC. The context in Africa is the same. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Your latest remarks was really important, underlining the fact that COVID-19 pandemic dramatically increased domestic violence, partner violence, as women were eventually trapped at the houses given the restrictive measures during the COVID-19 pandemic. And just like you underlined, it's very important that we analyze regional, country-based specific needs of women and girls, because even though we may agree on the globally accepted norms and policy makings, when we implement them on the grassroots levels, society levels, community levels, we do see differentiations in what we projected. And there are times that it doesn't really fit well for the norms of the country. It might be religious barriers, cultural barriers. So we have to take into account of all these factors in making policy briefs more effective. Thank you so much for all the important remarks. And just wanted to open the floor before we close. Any last reflections anybody would like to share before we say goodbye?
I really appreciate the opportunity, because I believe that, as I said in my speech, that coming together in smaller groups, we always, as human beings, think that we should generate solutions, in masses. No, I think, Mirna, you mentioned the bottom-up, actions. This is really important. We are here for people. Maybe, I don't know, hundreds or thousands, hopefully, people will be watching this, and it's going to change eventually.
And I think if I could just add to that, excuse me, on Hafsa's comment about we're always learning. And I think, as we sit here as individuals who have spent a lot of time learning, we have a certain level of awareness of what's happening that we can sort of, spread. But what Sylvain was talking about are everyday actions. And I think people want to know what they can do on a smaller level. And I think his comment around, modeling what we want to see is a really important way for anyone to contribute to prevention of violence against women and gender-based violence. And I think that is a grassroots sort of movement that can then, move through the youth, and the youth are eventually the individuals who are in those systems that are responding to individuals coming to them for help. So I think those are really important comments about our constant learning and our everyday actions as models for behavior.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's taking time out of their busy schedules to participate in this event. We really talked about some of the fundamental working areas to close the gap of gender equality in the full and effective implementation of SDG 5. We spoke on violence against women, how the grassroots organizations must be empowered and given enough safe dialogue space to work hand in hand with member states, UN agencies, and of course, feminist leadership norms, values that must be embedded in all levels of government policy making mechanisms. And lastly, we really stressed out the importance of he for she's, young male leadership. As I mentioned, they have an unproportionately higher access to decision-making mechanisms. So it must be a 50-50 work. Women's rights are never an issue for women and girls only. It's an equality matter. So I do really appreciate Sylvain's participation in today's gathering for that matter as well. And coming to an end, we had terrific CSW sessions this year as the team was very dynamic, as well. The main CSW team has been combating climate crisis and seeking gender justice in doing so at the CSW session, the session 66. And even though I really miss getting together with everyone in New York, with this the most populated UN civil society session, CSW, I am very appreciative of this virtual platforms that are offered by the NGO CSW that really facilitated ways for us from US, New York, Canada, Congo, for us to get together and share our own regional priorities, perspectives. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for sharing their comments, questions, feedback. So till next time, thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.